I think we have obviously have new powers that weren't there before '82. Have we been too activist? I don't think on the whole the courts have been. I think they're trying to do their job of upholding the Constitution and upholding the law.
Today is the end of the McLachlin Court, Beverly McLachlin's last day as Chief Justice of Canada's Supreme Court. That was from an interview I did with her on Tuesday. You can see the full thing on The National this coming Sunday. And even though I'm in New York City on assignment, At Issue must go on. So let's do that. Let's talk more about the Supreme Court, who was appointed this week, and the legacy McLachlin leaves behind. Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, Chantal Hébert in Montreal, and joining us for the first time, Kelly Kreiderman, and she is in Calgary. Chantal, I'll start with you on this, if I can. What do you make of what Beverly McLachlin said there about activism, and whether she, in fact, did make the Supreme Court more activist, or whether it was just a result of the Charter?
I'm not sure that she made it more activist. I think the activism came before she became Chief Justice. The Morgenthaler ruling on abortion, for instance, predates her. But I think that it is true that over all those years that she was Chief Justice, the court became more central and certainly more present in the minds of many Canadians. And it also managed the feat that the media, Parliament, and many other institutions did not manage, and that is to hang on to its credibility.
And so, Andrew, does that mean that the court, that Beverly McLachlin, I guess, has left the court in a better place? Are you willing to go there?
Yeah, I mean, it is, as Chantal said, it's a central part of many of our conversations. It has laid down landmark rulings that have stood the test of time. I think you could also see an increasing tendency, I think, in the later years for the court to be a little bit all over the map. I mean, not activist per se. Conservatives like to call activism anytime the court strikes down a law. But it does matter whether you're striking down the law based on a coherent and reasonable reading of the Constitution. And likewise, sometimes courts will uphold laws that they should have struck down. And again, you can call that a kind of activism. And I think that would be my criticism more, is that it was increasingly hard to find any kind of consistent or coherent through line in the reasoning. A lot of times it looked like the court had a destination it was bound and determined to get to, and it would figure out the reasoning that would get it there later. So it would, set aside established precedent with only a kind of a fig leaf of reasoning, or it would cherry pick legislation, the relevant provisions. So I don't think they're above criticism, but they've certainly made their mark and are a central part of their constitutional firmament.
And Kelly, what did you make of what the former Chief Justice had to say there?
I think, she kind of was there as the Supreme Court grew up from the Constitution and the Charter in 1982 as it became more refined, as the court found its place. She became the standard bearer for gender parity on the Supreme Court. And I also think it's a strength that she was difficult to pigeonhole. She was activist. She struck down mandatory minimums, which riled the government of the day, the conservative government of the day. At the same time, just this fall, she was warning that as sexual assault cases are heard, the presumption of innocence and the imperative to make sure that guilty people or innocent people are not found guilty still stands. So I think, her strength was her ability to bring cohesion to the court and to not pigeonhole herself one way or the other, I think, in a lot of cases.
But I think she was also, she wouldn't probably agree with me on that, but I think she was in the end fortunate to have these conflicts with Stephen Harper. It certainly raised the profile of the court, but it also raised the profile of the notion of the rule of law, which I think is important. And I think for many Canadians, it brought a better understanding of what the court is about. And from that angle, not being totally predictable, not to the point of inconsistency, is probably an advantage, because if the Supreme Court is that predictable, then it becomes kind of a body of the status quo. You know what they're going to say, so you go there to get what you want. And I don't think you would want that from the Supreme Court.
But oftentimes logical consistency...
Okay, Andrew, go ahead, yep.
Oftentimes logical consistency will appear to be unpredictable. So that's fine. As I say, I think in some cases the logic wasn't there in some of their rulings. As you say, Chantal, they were at daggers drawn sometimes with the Harper government, and I think the Harper government's unreasonability in one direction was sometimes mirrored by the court's own unreasonability.
Okay, I want to switch topics just to sort of close the circle on tax reform, and maybe not on Bill Morneau, but maybe on tax reform. Here's what he had to announce this week.
I understand that people running small businesses want to make sure that they have regulations that are easily understood and easy to work with. So what we've done here is we've made it very clear.
We believe there is too much uncertainty and too much confusion for the government to proceed on the timelines it has suggested to Canadians.
That, of course, was the Senate trying to push back a little bit on the tax reform plan, even though the government has put some water in their wine. Kelly, do you think that the finance minister has a mandate to go forward with this tax reform, given how terribly it was rolled out the first time?
I think the government is intent on rolling out the tax reform, whether, they have a mandate of it, they have, they were elected on promises somewhat like what they've rolled out. I think the problem is, from the time the Prime Minister talked about small businesses taking advantage of tax loopholes in the 2015 election, and last July, there was a lot of space. They also promised to lower the small business tax, and that had kind of gone by the wayside at that time too. I think there was a real surprise in the way that this was all rolled out that is going to stick to the government in terms of the messaging, in terms of talking about taking advantage of tax schemes. And I don't think that changes. And I don't think that changes no matter the nuts and bolts rolled out and the adjustments made to the policy. I think that it's going to stick for the Liberal government.
Does it do enough to put this to bed for Bill Morneau, Chantal?
No, I don't think the Bill Morneau thing can be put to bed until whoever is the ethics commissioner rules on whatever he or she, because there's going to be a change, is looking into. But I'm not so sure that it's going to stick to the government, because it happened in the first 2 years of the mandate. And because, in theory, a government warned is a government that doesn't repeat its own mistakes. So I'm not convinced that a year and a half from now we're going to be talking about this, depending on how they handle the future.
Well, Bill Morneau himself is greatly damaged by this. I mean, the intent of the legislation was fine. There are, thousands of people have been incorporating themselves to reduce their tax burden. That's problematic from a number of perspectives. But they did it in the most complicated possible way. They've subsequently made revisions that have narrowed its scope and made it somewhat simpler, but it's still going to give people fits. But the bigger political damage was nobody seemed to ask themselves, as they were framing this legislation to go after people for setting up private corporations to reduce their tax burden, geez, do you think anybody will mention our private corporations, our meaning Bill Morneau's and indeed Justin Trudeau's? And I think Chantal's right that we're not necessarily going to be talking about this issue 2 years from now, but there's a narrative that's now been constructed for the opposition of entitled rich kids running the government. And that's not just with this, that's with, the dinners with the Chinese billionaires and the holidays with the Aga Khan. That narrative may cling more, and that's something the Liberals have to be very aware of.
Well, last word to you, Chantal, on that. I just wonder what it does to the Liberals and the notion of taxes, which is, a dirty word regardless, probably for lots of Canadians, but particularly if you're a Liberal. Does it taint them in any way?
I have to measure what happened in those by-elections, and I know that by-elections are only that, but I have to measure the fact that it didn't have a tremendous negative impact on them and all the noise in the House of Commons. And I'm more struck by the disconnect between the two than by the gist or the substance of the argument. I am not picking up on the ground this notion that this is a government of rich kids who are ruling tax changes to benefit themselves. So maybe that will penetrate. I believe they're smart enough to walk away from that.
Okay, I got to leave it there. Andrew, Chantal, and Kelly, thank you for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.